Hello, so today's video is going to be on this, the CV-715 nuclear survey meter. Lots of people confuse these with these, the CD700 series sort of Geiger counters. This is actually a Geiger counter, see it's got a Geiger Miller tube on it. Unfortunately I need to repair this one because after a while of having it, and thankfully I filmed a video on it like within a day or two of having it when it still worked, this one went wrong. So this is going to be like a long-term repair project, but the CD715 is a completely different thing, and it's also not a Geiger counter. So a lot of people buy these, get disappointed because they're not a Geiger counter, but it's not meant to be a Geiger counter, it's a different kind of unit. Now, so we're going back to the 1960s, sort of 1950s, 1960s, and the US Cold War planning. And the idea was that you'd have a civil defence, which is always a good idea, as you can see, CD, civil defence. And the idea was that, you have these guys who are issued with equipment. So if there's a nuclear war or nuclear disaster, they can kind of do some stuff and not die horribly. Or, prevent the amount of dying horribly. I guess you're never going to really prevent dying horribly if, mutually assured destruction happens. But the idea with these, basically, these civil defence things, was that, the volunteers could get an idea of what sort of radiation they were encountering. Now, that's an important thing to point out now, that the Soviet stuff is probably actually better. I know a lot of Americans won't want to think so, but I'll explain why. The reason is, with the CD-V series of sort of equipment, you've got the Geiger counter for low-range radiation, and you've got these survey meters for high-range radiation, and they don't really cross over properly, because the CD-V-700 goes up to 50 millirontgens per hour. This starts, if you use the lowest part of the scale, because this is in rontgens per hour, it goes from 0 to 500 millirontgens per hour, and the problem is that even on the lowest bit there, which would be 100 millirontgen on the scale, that isn't really crossing over, is it, with 50 millirontgen. So although they're not too far away from each other where they start, the problem is you could still probably face radiation that sits in between the range of the Geiger counter and the survey meter. I know that's probably not all that common, but the point is that the Soviet and Warsaw Pact Geiger counters tend to go from the millirontgen range into the hundreds of rontgen range. So they had a single device that could do everything. If you look at the Soviet DP5 series, went from 0 millirontgen all the way up to 200 rontgen per hour. Polish DP66 was the same, and then the Polish DP75 went to 500 rontgen per hour in that same, started from 0, went to that. Now, there are advantages to ion chambers compared to Geiger counters for high-range radiation. That's it's harder to saturate them. So if I just open this up and show you the inside, because these are very, very simple. This is your entire device. The big thing there, that is the ion chamber. You have an ion chamber in your smoke alarm. How an ion chamber works is, I think it's kept at a positive pressure. Bear in mind, I'm not an electrician, but I kind of understand the fundamentals of it. What happens, this is kept at positive pressure. Not positive pressure, like positive charge, I should say. I'm using gas mask terminology now. When radiation enters it, basically it can detect the radiation due to that. Now what you also see on the side is the voltage selector or adjustment calibration switches for each of the ranges. So you'll see it goes from the one with a weird symbol, times 1, 10 and 100, that coincides with these switches, so that makes sense. It takes 1D battery. I've just done a little bit of modification there by shoving a bit of paper on either side so it doesn't fall out. And that's basically it. It's a very, very simple unit, as it should be. I've also got some silica gel, the original silica gel that came with it, and some additional silica gel in there. The reason being that you need to keep ion chamber units very, very sort of dry. They don't like being moist. So there we go. So how this works is pretty simple. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to adjust the camera to look at the ground in a second, so I can actually do it on a flat surface, because these generally work better on a flat surface. This is definitely better than the German one. When it's turned on, it doesn't keep, the needle doesn't keep moving too much if you wave it about, but it does ever so slightly. And that's to do with apparently air pressure and air movement inside the ion chamber. Something to point out as well, this has a sealed ion chamber in it. So bad news if you puncture it. The German one seems to just work using air. There's pros and cons to each type. The pros to this is it's a self-sealed unit and it's more sensitive. The problem is obviously if you puncture it you're in trouble. But people have said online that if you puncture it you can solder it closed after heating up the unit. And then what will happen is you'll use air rather than the inert gas that's in there. It's not as sensitive, but the unit will still work. So you know, there's that. So anyway, what we're going to do now is we're going to have a look at the functions of the unit, and I'm going to demonstrate it, but sadly I don't think I've got anything quite hot enough to get a gamma only meter to move. And that's an important thing. I think this only does gamma and X-rays. I think the manual did specify if you've got very strong beta energy that can penetrate certain, so not necessarily the, you know, how hot the radiation is with the beta, so not like the Röntgen range, although, you know, it would have to be in the range that the meter detects, but just the energy of it. So how, like carbon-14 is low energy beta that behaves like alpha, if you've got very high energy beta that behaves like low energy gamma, that will probably read on this as well, especially if you use it without it inside the yellow case. But anyway, what we're going to do now is turn it on. I'm going to show you the switches and dials. The only annoying things of these, of course, is the handle is right in the way of where the switches are, so I'll probably have to turn it at a slightly diagonal angle, which will annoy me with my autism, but there you go. So what we're going to do is use this now, and I will run you through how you get it set up and working, because these are very easy to set up. An idiot could do it. So well done, America, for designing them that way, because that's how you should always design stuff for soldiers and civilians. Make it as hard as possible to break and as easy as possible to understand. Don't do what the Germans did with their ion chamber unit. It has a very precise set of instructions. You must follow at all times, or it will not work. Okay, so I'm afraid this is the best angle I can muster up, and I'm not particularly happy with it, but I can at least run you through the functions. So what we've got on here is circuit check, 0, times 1000, times 10, times 1, and times 0.1. Now, the time switches are fairly obvious. It's just whatever you read on here, you basically times it by that multiplier, or essentially do a tenth of it for the 0.1, and that's the radiation range you're in. So what we're going to do is first we're going to do a circuit check, and as you can see, oh look, the battery and the needle stops exactly in the circuit check area, which is what we want. The point of circuit check is checking that power goes to the unit, basically, and it does. So there we go, that works. So what we're going to do now is go to 0. So what we do, we go to 0, and as you can see, it's not stopped on 0. So what we do now is we adjust this up and down, the 0, and you need to do it very gently because the 0 is a bit fiddly on this. And you get it till it stops, strangely enough, on the 0. So that looks pretty bang on to me at the angle I'm at now. So now what we're going to do is, it does say in the manual that it's generally worth leaving it in the 0 position for about a minute to help the device warm up properly. For the sake of this video, because I've not got anything really radioactive enough to get proper readings on this, that's not all that necessary, but if you were using these properly you'd have to do that. Also notice this was used until at least July 93 by the property of Texas Department of Health, and they calibrated it then, so that's kind of cool. Because yeah, although these are really old 1960s units, it turned out loads of these were kept in service for ages because they were actually very useful. You know, it was much cheaper to just keep these calibrated and working than it was to spend, you know, thousands of dollars buying new ion chambers from various companies, when these things were just as good, really. Okay, so what we're going to do now is go to the times 0.1 scale. And what should happen in a moment is the needle should go back to 0. There we go, that's pretty much on the 0. It's gone just over the 0 now, but some of that will depend on the voltage calibration in the unit for each of the settings. And also, I think somebody said in a review of this, it's also because when you do the 0, it doesn't regard any background radiation, which is a nice thing about the 0 function on this. So when you're in the 0 setting, it won't take any readings, so you can get it as close to 0 as possible. So if you're in a radiation field, when you 0 it, you can actually 0 it in a radiation field. You don't, you know, need to measure background radiation, then minus it off and try and get the needle a bit lower, so when there's the background it will go to 0 at that regard. So there we go, it's only just over 0. In terms of 0 to 1, it's not even at the 0.1 sort of bit, you know, on 0.1 scale, so that's good. Right, now let me get my magic box that a lot of you will be familiar with if you've seen the videos, so hopefully that's in frame, and this is my box full of nuclear materials, all perfectly legal. You know, I keep lead shielding around it when it's not in use for safety reasons, but there's some quite interesting stuff in here. Now, one thing I also want to check while I'm here is, because I've been keeping this DKP50 dosimeter pen in there, I want to hold it up to a light source and see what reading I've got. Ooh! It has gone to 15 Röntgen. Bloody hell. My box is very good. Okay, so the nice thing is with the shielding, you basically get background readings on the outside. On the inside now, we're getting lots and lots of Röntgens. So that's an interesting thing. So I've got a few things in here. I've got some extracted thorium lamp mantles in here. I doubt this is going to do anything thorium lamp mantles and thorium, I think dioxide is the name of the thing in there, do give off a bit of gamma, but it's mostly a beta emitter. And I think it's during the decay sometimes they shoot off gamma. So sometimes you'll be looking at a Geiger counter near the box and suddenly you'll see a tiny like spike in energy when obviously I guess a gamma comes and hits a GM tube. Otherwise nothing from that. Right, the hottest thing I have in here is this very kind of boring looking thing in here. And what that is radium dust, where I've had the like aircraft dials that were in damaged condition, some of them. I've just got the loose radium kind of dust off and put it in here. So what we're going to do is put that near there and see if we get any movement. I don't think we are, but that's a very strong alpha, beta and gamma emitter radium. I think radium's meant to be about 1,000 times more radioactive than natural uranium. What we're also going to do is put a couple of other things up to the thing that might give a reading. Things to the thing, that's not very descriptive, is it? But what I mean is a bit more radium paint on here. I don't know if that's going to do anything. That's the radium paint that hadn't chipped off. I've got another flight dial here. You'll notice I've got everything in bags now. That's just a good safety precaution, because by keeping it in bags, you're not going to have like the dust flake everywhere. Some more extracted thorium and everything else. Let's pop that there as well. I think the needle may have moved ever so slightly, but it's not moved much at all. But the point is, you know, that with a Geiger counter you'd be getting very strong readings from this. Because this is gamma and designed for high range use, this is what I'm saying, you probably won't get the needle to move unless you've got something like cobalt 60 or cesium-137 to check from it. I'm just seeing in here if I've got anything else that's particularly interesting. I could try the strontium 90 on it actually, because I don't know if it's high enough energy beta. It's probably not, but we'll just try that. No, I can't see any movement. But what I'll do now, just for the sake of the video, just to see if anything happens, I will take this out of its case. I might have to re-zero it. I'll put it down there. Because see, the needle's gone up quite a bit, but I think that was just a movement of the device. So let's just go back to 0, because it apparently ignores all radiation for 0. Now the calibration needle is in quite a different place now, so let's put it back to 0. There we go. Let's go to time 0.1, let it warm up and see if it detects any more radiation or not. As I said, this was last calibrated in 93, and I've messed about with it a bit, so the calibration is probably completely off, but until I have a check source that's in high enough range for this, that gives me an exact number, I won't actually be able to tell the calibration properly. And I think, yes, that does give a slightly higher number. Let's just put the strontium 90 there. No, that doesn't make a difference. So the strontium 90 obviously doesn't actually do anything on this because it's probably not high enough in energy to penetrate the ion chamber. But in terms of other things, let's just get that radium a bit closer. Whatever else I was putting on there. Yeah, you can't really see much movement, but that's what you'd expect. So as far as I'm aware, this device is working absolutely fine. It's just that, obviously, unless you've got a really strong gamma emitter, like a high Curie size bit of cesium-137 or cobalt 60, you won't see anything happen on this. This also came with the regular carry strap, which is still in this packet and I've not attached. You saw that on my video for the V-715, so I won't show you that. But I will quickly run you through the instruction manual, so that's quite interesting. So let me pack all the radioactive stuff safely away, and then I will show you the other stuff. Right, I'll flick through the manual, but there's one particular page of interest to me in here. So there you go, Instrument and Maintenance Manual, Radiological Survey Meter, OCD item number CD, V-715, model number 1A, manufactured 1962. The Victorine Instrument Company, 5806 Hugh Avenue, Cleveland, 3, Ohio. So there you go, bit of a mouthful, but Victorine's kind of one of the famous ones. Anyway, there's your contents. I'm not going to read all of this. I'm going to kind of flick through it to show you the pages, and then I'm going to show you the bit I found particularly interesting. So just pause on the video anywhere. Hopefully the new camera keeps this in autofocus well enough that when you spot a bit you're interested in, you can pause and see it. I'm sure there's like PDF scans of this manual online somewhere, because in general there are for most of these old manuals, which is nice. And you don't even need this one translated if you speak English, because it's actually, although it's in American English, it's in English. So there we go. It's also saying if you get a reading in the low area of the meter there, which is quite interesting, you shouldn't take it really for fact, because that could just be, you know, kind of background movement. Troubleshooting page and all that. Try and get it up there. some circuit diagrams, always nice to have these, because, you know, this is back when they expected people to fix things themselves, not send it off to be repaired. Spare parts list. Now, and on the back it says Victorine, there you go. It reminds me a bit of the Ingsoc logo in the 1984 film. But anyway, let me find you the bit I found particularly interesting, especially because I've been finding radiation and radium so interesting. Let's read the calibration bit. I'll just hold that up so it's... I'm trying to actually work out where the framing would be for the that bit. There we go. Right, you're just going to have to pause there, but I'll look at it and read it properly in a second. Right, so there we go, calibration. The CD-V-17 is calibrated by being placed in a gamma radiation field of known dose rate. That's sort of saying you have to, when you calibrate it, you have to know how much, you know, your dose is, otherwise you're not calibrating it. You know, you can't zero something properly in that regard, otherwise. Such fields are most commonly produced by using a radioactive material such as radium or cobalt-60. Now I find it interesting they say radium, because you can fairly easily get radium as a civilian in the UK. Because, as I've complained about before, in the UK and a lot of EU countries, the problem with certain radioactive isotopes is even if you're trying to buy them as a sealed proper check source, which is a lot safer than buying like old antique goods that contain radioactive materials, it can be quite hard to get hold of them because of how the law tries to kind of limit it to people who work in kind of science fields, which you could argue is all well and good, but because the legislators don't know about all the other things that contain radiation, it doesn't really work. But it means if you're ever trying to calibrate devices like this, it's very painstaking and annoying. But anyway, as an example, a 1 Curie radium source will produce a radiation dose of 4 Rontgen per hour at a distance of 18.1 inches. And that's the bit I find really interesting, because they're literally saying if you have a Curie of radium, and I assume this is radium, that radium sort of, you know, 226 or whatever, that's brand new, not had any decay period in half-life, and you have it, you know, at that exact distance, and 1 Curie, I believe, is exactly 1 gram, that would be, you know, they're actually giving you numbers, which is really handy in here. The CDV-715 should read a dose rate when so positioned with the centre of the ion chamber at this distance. If it does not, the instrument should be recalibrated. This is accomplished by removing it from the case and adjusting the individual cal controls for the corresponding ranges, so that the proper reading is indicated on the meter. So that's the bit I was showing you of the little, you know, 4 electric switches. The distance from the centre of the CDV-715 ionisation chamber to the calibration source should be at least 12 inches to obtain reasonable geometry. Reasonably uniform radiation intensity over the volume of the ionisation chamber. So it's saying, you know, so it's not too intense or too weak. But that's an interesting thing. They actually give you calibration instructions in here, because it's easy enough to do if you have a check source and you know what the check source produces. That's the thing, you have to know what your check source produces, otherwise it's useless. But how you could do it at home, I suppose, if you're restricted by all the stuff like I am, is that when you've got something strong enough to give a definite reading on the meter, if you have a couple of other Geiger counters and similar things, get readings off of them, know roughly what the reading should be, and then calibrate the CDV-715 to be roughly in that region as well. That's not precise calibration, but it at least gives you something to go on. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video on the CDV-715. As I said, it's not a Geiger counter, it doesn't make noises. Some people go, oh, it clicks and beeps. No, it doesn't. It's, as far as I'm aware, it doesn't. I know some ion chamber units can make noises, but I haven't even seen a piezoelectric buzzer inside, so I don't think it will make any noise. But the point is, a CDV-715 is an ion chamber for oh shit levels of radiation, hence why it goes all the way up to 500 Rontgen per hour if you're on the higher settings, times 100 at the times 5. Interestingly, I think it's called the CDV-720. There is a version of this that actually has a beta shield on the bottom, a bit like the German ion chamber. If ever I find somebody who's willing to ship that to the UK for a decent price and working condition, I would love to try one of those, because I'm imagining with radium and strontium-90 over it, you could get some really interesting readings, and I love kind of these classic Cold War bits of kit. But there you go. I bought this from America. It took about 3 weeks to arrive, no fault of the sellers, just because they did dispatch it straight away and I had tracking info. It just had to go from, you know, one state to another state before it got to a shipping thing. Then it was like a week of being shipped on a cargo ship, I imagine, and then, you know, had to be delivered by a UK courier. But it did eventually turn up and it works, as far as I can tell. So, a big thank you to the seller. Again, it wasn't that cheap to get due to the postage prices of having them sent over to the UK, but I'm willing to pay that now and again for stuff you can't easily get hold of. Especially with that sort of, you know, international trade arms agreement thing, or whatever it is, restrictions that America likes, where they ban lots of old surplus equipment. Maybe this doesn't fall under it because it's civil defence, not military. Who knows? But then you've got the weird things, is it the CDV-718, which is the Geiger counter, which is actually the US military spec one. It's just painted yellow, literally, and reads Rontgens rather than greys. And would that be considered by ITAR, even though it is US military equipment? Who knows? But anyway, the V-715 is a really interesting piece of kit. I don't know how much I'd recommend it for actual doomsday use. A Geiger counter would be far more useful for most people, especially because, you know, you can actually get measurements on that. And what I will just do before I wrap up the video is get a Geiger counter and just show you the needle moving near my radioactive box, so you actually get a reading from it, whereas this thing basically didn't say anything. But as said, that's what you'd expect from this, because this is for, you know, Chernobyl levels, or loads of atomic and hydrogen bombs have just gone off levels of radiation, you know. The I'm going to die levels of radiation, not the, you know, oh, that's a lot higher than background, but this can't read at levels of radiation. So there's the radiation box without the lead shielding. Here's my mini monitor. Hopefully you can see that display alright in there. I'll try and hold it up like this so you can see it a bit better. So the mini monitor's on. I'll turn the speaker on. Hear that? That's because no shielding on the box currently. Some bits of the box are probably a bit hotter than other bits, depending on where the samples are stored. This would pretty much only be gamma at the moment, because although I've not got the beta, like the alpha shield on, obviously alpha's not going to read through there. High energy beta might, but as you can hear, the V-715, you know, didn't pick anything up from this, even though it's visibly there. And if I open this box and pop the probe inside, it will probably sound like a nuke's gone off. So let's just get this open. That's why I like these boxes, for storing this kind of stuff, because it's quite safe. There we go. That's where it found the radium, by the way. But that's the extracted thorium there. But yeah, that should hopefully give you an indication of, you know, why a Geiger counter is a lot more practical for most people. But, you know, the V-715 is what it is, and it does a good job of being what it does, really.